Hello, welcome to my podcast and to my YouTube channel. Today we have a British author with us, Malcolm Stern. He's also a psychotherapist. He has worked with individuals in a lot of group work, right, Malcolm, for
Yeah.
nearly 30 years. And he is the author, this is why he's actually here, you'll understand soon. He's the author of Slay Your Dragons with Compassion, 10 Ways to Thrive Even When It Seems Impossible. I'm sure that was a very, very hard book to write, Malcolm, and I'm sorry for your loss.
Thank
He, he wrote this book after the loss, well, a few years after the loss of his daughter to suicide, Melissa. So, welcome to the podcast, and I'm sorry you had to go through that to write that book, Malcolm.
Well, what's interesting is that the book wrote itself. I wrote my last book in 2004, and I've been wanting to write another book, and nothing was happening. Melissa took her life in 2014, and um, I started doing some writing. I wrote some poetry around it, and then suddenly it's like I felt the rush to look at what it
Hmm.
is I'd learned that had helped me stay stable in the face of the most terrible tragedy that can happen, just about, which is losing a child to suicide. And this book wrote itself. I worked with a friend of mine who was like a ghostwriter, and we would go on Zoom 2 mornings a week, and we'd just shape the book with a Google Doc.
Mm-hmm.
And once we had the pattern of the book established, it took about 18 months to do that. It took about 10 months to write the whole book, which
Oh.
was for me is brilliant because my first book took 4 years, and
Yeah, it's
this
pretty fast. I mean, 10 months to
this
write
rolled
is
out.
pretty fast.
And often when a book is written really fast, it's because the book's rubbish. But this isn't rubbish. This book is actually a
Ah,
profound
no,
testament.
no, no, it's not rubbish at all. And I have to disagree. I think that when you write that fast, the book was already ready to be written.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with you. Yes.
So, Malcolm, let's start with that. With you talked a little bit about the process of writing the book, but more technical. Let's talk about the story behind the book. Because, as you know, my audience, there are a lot of people listening to my podcast who have lost not just kids, but parents and friends and loved ones to suicide. So, let's talk about Melissa. Tell
Yeah.
me a little bit about your daughter and what happened to her.
Well, Melissa is a very beautiful, loving, wise young woman. She was 33 years old. About 10 years before she took her life, she had a serious psychotic breakdown. And she rang
Mm.
me and she said, "Hello, Dad, I'm in a lunatic asylum." I said, "Very funny, Melissa." And she passed the phone to a nurse, and she
Mhm.
was in an intensive care psychiatric facility. And it took her a year to get through that. And in that time, she's lost a lot of her verve and a lot of her colour, but it all came back. And for the next 10 years, she seemed really fine. And she got married the year before she took her life in 2013. Beautiful guy called Ian, and she was seemingly very happy. She worked for Kids Company, which is a big organisation who are dealing with very, very damaged children, and she was right in the front line of working with children who are come from terrible abuse and deprivation. And she just gave her all to everything she did. And she dressed beautifully. She dressed in bright colours and lipsticks, and I just hear her laughing. She was always laughing, just wild, abandoned laugh. And then she got very hyper. So about probably a year before she died, she started to get really hyper again, and then that lasted for about 6 months. And one of the things I learned, and I learned this later, and I'll tell you a bit more about this later on, is that when your child, who you love, is hyper, they often become vile as well. And so it's like I found myself not liking Melissa very much in this hyper state. And I was judging myself for that and feeling, my God, this is my daughter. What are you doing? And but actually, she kept up this hyperness, and we managed to connect at certain times. But a lot of the time, she was just all over the place. And then about 6 weeks before she took her life, that hyper descended into a place of serious depression. And I only spoke to her a couple of times when she was in that depressed state. And there was something so flat about her. I didn't think she was going to take her life, but there was something so flat about her that I realized that she was in really bad shape and didn't know what to do.
Mm. It must have been so hard for you. One of the things that you wrote was, with all my years of as a psychotherapist, nothing had prepared me for this. So, Malcolm, I'm sure that, especially because you are a psychotherapist, so theoretically we are trained to see these symptoms, right? And the
Yes.
warning signs for,
Yes.
I'm sure that brought about a lot of guilt for quite a while. How did you handle that?
Well, it did bring about a lot of guilt. And what I needed to do was to take my own medicine, which was to get support. And I did
Mm.
that in a number of different ways, because I think in my book, Slay Your Dragons with Compassion, which I'll just briefly flash across the screen here, which I'm really proud of, which is basically inspired by Melissa's death. It's also inspired by the practices that I realized that I had embraced, and that when Melissa died, I already had a handhold. I already knew there were certain things I could do that would carry on supporting me. First of all, I needed to be around people who could reflect honestly to me with compassion, but also who were going to stay in a relationship with me. That was very important. So you get the people who are going, oh, I'm so sorry for your loss, but actually you just feel like there's nothing there. And then you get the people who want to avoid you, who do. I was in a men's group at the time, and one of the guys in the group started whistling every time I came into the room. It was like he couldn't handle being around me after she
Wow.
died. And bit by bit, you learn who your community is, who your Sangha, which is one of the titles in my chapter, create your own Sangha. It's a Buddhist term for a spiritual community. I needed to create that. I also went into, there's an organisation called the Samaritans in the UK. I don't know if you've heard of them,
Yes,
or
I know
maybe
the
what.
Samaritans. I've interviewed them for my book. Yeah.
Great. Well, they ran a 6-week group for people who had been bereaved by suicide. And so I went to that group, and it was hard for me because I'm a very, very well established group leader, and I've been running groups for 30 years. And I was in a
Mm.
group with a lot of other bereaved people, and I had to really allow myself to receive from the group leader and from the group. But
Mm.
I learned from other people who were in a similar situation, their journey and what they were going through. And then I was also able to share some of mine. And one of the most important things I heard in this group was a very lovely anaesthetist who had lost her son to suicide. And she said, I was so hurt after he died because there were times when I really disliked him. And suddenly I realized I had permission to actually have all of the feelings that I had, including that sense that I was, sort of sometimes revolted by her. And that was pretty awful. But I've had to really do a lot of soul searching around all of that.
Yeah, yeah. I just when in the beginning when you said, and I didn't like her very much. That must be very hard for a parent
Well,
to even admit that, right?
horrible. But one of my practices is utter authenticity, because actually, if I can't be straight with myself, then I'm living a phony life. And then if I can't have people around me with whom I can be straight, then I'm also living a phony life. So for me, it was very important to go to the crux and see what the hell it was that was going on.
Hmm. Malcolm, I'm so glad you brought this up because I think it's one of the hardest challenges for the bereaved, is to actually establish boundaries with people and realize that you may have this friend who absolutely loves you, and we're not questioning that. It doesn't mean they can handle it.
Yes,
So we
exactly.
have to establish what you said. I needed people who really could be with me and
Yes,
can hold your pain and be there. And that has nothing to do with love,
yes,
right?
exactly. And it's about often people who've been on their own journey and have suffered themselves. Now, interestingly, I find that as a psychotherapist, my work has exponentially improved. I am able to go to places because I've been there, and that makes a hell of a difference. And the people who are able to go to those places with me had often been there. So one of my friends had been walking with his 3 children on a quiet country road, and suddenly a car came by, hit one of his children, who died instantly, and that child was 10 years old, and he and I were able to have conversations because he'd been bereaved, and lost a child, and knew what I was going through.
You established a different kind of connection, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
A shared
When,
grief.
yeah, when you said nothing prepared me for this, and now that you mentioned that, I think I'm doing even better now as a psychotherapist because I had the lived experience. Have you read David Kessler's book, the latest one, Finding Meaning?
Well, interesting. David Kessler, I run a series called Alternatives at St. James's when you're
Uh-huh.
doing it. David
Uh-huh.
Kessler has spoken there a couple of times.
Yes, yes,
I
and
haven't read his
he,
latest.
yeah. So he says in his book, when it happened, because he lost his son to, it wasn't to suicide, but he lost his son, and he said, when that happened to me, I wanted to call all my clients and say, I'm so sorry, I had no idea what you were going through. Did you go
Well,
through that?
I didn't go through that. No, no. I think what I went through was a humbling, and that was
Mm,
actually quite powerful as well. That actually, I felt like I used to feel like I had a charmed life. I was skilled in the work that I did. I had good friendships. I'd had good relationships, and
mhm,
I felt like my life was pretty charmed. And suddenly that crumpled, and there was a humbling in that actually I had to accept that life was never going to be the same for me, and it never will be the same for me.
No, no. It doesn't mean you won't have a life, right? And you can have a
Oh, I
very
have a life. I have a rich
fulfilling
life.
one, very fulfilling one.
It's a very fulfilling life, and what's really interesting is my other two children, who are my other two children are my the product of my marriage. Melissa was the daughter of an earlier relationship, which was a brief relationship, but my other two children adored her, and I actually sort of feel that it's strengthened my relationship with my other children because I feel so much more protective, but not in a smothering way. I feel so much more like I have to notice when things are not right with them, and that they may come to me with their difficulties, and I need to be ready and present if they do come to me with those, that I don't look past them and ignore their distress calls. And it's not that they're in distress all the time, they're not at all, but there are times when I realise something's going on for them, and that they need their
Hmm.
daddy as well. And these are kids in their 20s and early 30s, so yes.
How did that affect your family, Malcolm? Because sometimes it can be so hard for a family to go through a suicide. I mean, it's always hard, but sometimes it becomes a source of conflict for the family. Did that
Well,
happen to you?
very interestingly, there were two strands to this, because there was Melissa's mother, and we'd had a very difficult relationship. And in fact, Melissa and her mother and I went into therapy together a few months before she died to try and work out our stuff. And we were never able to do that. And in fact, I felt like that was an opportunity that we could have got closer. But in fact, her mother refused to allow me to speak at her funeral, which I thought was a very violent act. And
Wow.
and she also said that if Amanda wants to come to the funeral, Amanda is my ex-wife. She doesn't want her coming to the funeral. And I said, well, if Amanda's not coming, I'm not coming either. And so she then relented, said, well, I don't want her in the front row. So I felt like my relationship with Melissa's mother was permanently destroyed. And that feels good and right and proper. It felt like I'd been trying for 35 years to build a relationship that I was never going, not because anything wrong with her or anything wrong with me, but we didn't find a way of connecting. Conversely, Amanda, my ex-wife, who was Melissa's stepmother, or acted as a stepmother at times, she and I became much closer over this because she was truly grieving and along with me, and I felt like the family pulled together, and
Hmm.
and that was profound. And I think that my children and my ex-wife and I bonded in a way that was really profound in the face of this.
Hmm. Hmm. Let's talk about the title of your book. So,
Yeah,
why slay your dragons? You say that dragons are challenges that block your way, right? So, I want
yes.
you to talk a little bit about that and also tell me, who were your dragons?
Well, I think we have a lot of dragons in our life. We have people who are difficult for us. And they are people, and when I say slay your dragons, I'm not talking about getting a knife out and sticking it in them. It's a bit like if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him, is not saying murder the Buddha. What it's saying is that actually, this is a phrase I've used a lot over as a therapist. I heard it in an obscure song, that the line "slay your dragons with compassion," and it stuck in my head. And I've been wrestling with that terminology for the last 15, 20 years. And and my dragons were all the people who were difficult in my life, and the people with whom I would go one of two ways. And one way would be to cut them out and just step away. But I did that quite rarely. The other was to lose my power around them. And there's something about noticing when you've lost your essence in the face of another person. It's a bit like Superman and kryptonite. It's a bit like some of these people are like kryptonite for you. And one of the things I'm learning to do is to speak my truth and make sure I do the best I can so that the other person can receive me, but not to lose my truth no matter what. And for me, that's slaying my dragons. And then the same for me, slaying my dragons with myself, is facing the reality of what's going on for me rather than escaping every time there's a difficult thought or there's a difficult challenge that's in my life.
Mm-hmm. Your book, it tells the story of you, tells the story of Melissa, and then it goes into what you call 10 ways to thrive, right? So I would like to explore at least 3 or 4 of them.
Right.
And I want to start with my favorite one. Let your relationships educate you. Because we have this idea that relationships are easy, they should be easy, or they should come naturally. And we don't really stop to think about what am I learning with this person, right? Or with this relationship. So why did you write that? Why is that the first one?
Well, my first 2 books were both about relationships. And funnily enough, I was just having tea today with my original publisher, Judy Piatkas from Piatkas Books. And she said, I was saying, I think I've got another book in me now after this one. She said, relationships are going to be ever present. She said that feels like your skill. And but actually, why I wrote about Let Your Relationships Educate You is, I don't know if you know Robin Skinner and John Cleese's book, Families and How to Survive Them.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lovely thought bubble there where 2 people fall in love looking across a crowded room, and their unconscious thought bubble is, what a divinely damaged neurosis. And what we're drawn to in relationship is the damage in ourselves. I've seen this time and again in my own relationships. We're drawn to the places inside us that are not healed. And I think the relationships have the capacity to bring us to healing in the places where there had been childhood wounds which have never been faced. Of course, therapy has that capacity, but I think relationship is almost like a rocket ship to that place, because you cannot hide in relationships. And one of my teachers, Ram Dass, I don't know if you've heard of him, but he was an amazing teacher for me. But he used to say that if he ever believed what it is people said about him, he's amazing, he's enlightened, he's so compassionate, so kind, all of these things, all of the adulation you get as a teacher. If he started to believe that, all he had to do was be in a relationship for 6 months. And so there's something for me about not hiding in relationship. And that's the place where we have to face ourselves. And we often find that people stay in relationships a really long time, long after the relationship is dead. And
Oh,
what's important
yes.
is
We see that in
exactly,
couples a lot, right?
you do. And you'll see them in restaurants. Well, not at the moment, but when the lockdown finishes, you'll see them in restaurants that actually they're the 2 that aren't talking to each other at the table. And there's something about keeping our relationships fresh and practicing authenticity and honesty within our relationships. And I think there's something about also standing for yourself, that actually when you find that you're losing your power, you have to take a risk. Perhaps the relationship may not be able to withstand that risk. But if you find yourself losing your power, then you have to talk to your partner and say, this is going on for me, and see whether the relationship needs to be constantly reshaped and watered so that it can actually grow into something that becomes utterly trustworthy. And the basis of that is authenticity and honesty and integrity.
I love when when you talk about losing your power. I hadn't thought about that, but it does. I'm just going back here in my memories. People, sometimes people who are around you that you don't feel you can speak up, and with time, and you don't notice that with time, you just stop talking, right? You
Yes.
stop relating because you're afraid.
Exactly. And we're often afraid of ending the relationship, but actually, it's far better to take the risk to make the relationship stronger by speaking our truth and deepening the relationship. A friend of mine had a really good analogy for this. He used to say that being in a relationship is a bit like being in a hurdle race. And every so often a hurdle comes along, and you have to decide whether you're going to jump that hurdle together or not. So often we'll pull out of relationships too soon, as well as staying in relationships too long. We'll pull out of a relationship too soon because difficulties come along. And one of the things I've written in my book, I can't remember if it's this one or the one before this, is falling in love is like the temporary lifting of critical faculties.
I
For
love
all,
that.
yeah,
Any idiot can do that,
yeah,
right?
that's right. I just say that, didn't I? Yes. Any idiot can fall in love. You go, wow, how amazing. This person's fantastic. But actually,
Yeah.
after a while, you have to get real.
Mm. Loving, that's what you say. Loving is a different whole ball game, right? It's a
Yes.
whole different ball game. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, you are absolutely right. Falling in love is the first phase and then it goes away and what's left.
Yeah.
That
And what's left is a
that's when you
baptism.
realize whether or not the relationship is here to stay, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, number 2. This is a very important one for all of us. Take ownership of your own projections, right? But that starts with self-awareness, doesn't it? Because you have to realize what you're projecting into people. Sometimes we see people talking about someone and you go, is that real? Or is that something that's, because I do this to myself all the time. I'm always asking myself, am I projecting this or is this real?
Well, it's really interesting because I think all of it, when I'm looking at my book, I think that all of it is about consciousness. And yet it's trying to land it in different ways. And when we're not conscious, we'll just lash out and we'll do whatever we do, which is reactive, causing whatever trail of destruction we cause. So I know I was in a relationship once with probably the most selfish woman I've ever met. And she used to think of me as very selfish. And for a while I believed it. And of course, we all are selfish and unselfish in the whole
Of
work.
course, yeah.
But
Yeah.
actually, her projection, because she didn't look at her own selfishness, was to go, "You're this." And very often, we'll go about our partner, "You're this. You're violent," when actually the violence is actually living in our own hearts. You can't love when actually we can't love. So we will, and what we can do is not label with pejoratives the partner. You are this or you are that. The skill starts to be when you can actually say, "I felt hurt when you said that," rather than "you are a whatever it is that you want to call them." So I
Hmm.
think this project is a really important aspect because we're constantly projecting onto the world around us, and actually our call is to become conscious.
Hmm. Yeah, you wrote, and I think it's related to that in a way. You wrote, Melissa's death carried a hidden blessing.
Yeah,
It made me examine myself with painful honesty. I dared to go further into the darker aspects of life, the shadowlands, which house the capacity for healing. I
that was
love that.
words. Did I write that? That's fantastic.
Yeah, I know it's fun, isn't it? When someone says, you wrote this, and you go, what? This is the second or third time when I read something to an author and they go, wow, did I write that?
That's amazing because actually it's like that for me feels like a very naked statement. The truth is, as I said before, it humbles you. And
Yeah.
I had to sort of search for my support systems. Now, one of the interesting things that happen when you're bereaved, at the moment I'm currently running a suicide support group for an organisation called Compassionate Mental Health, and we meet once a week on a Thursday evening. And so I'm hearing different ways of dealing with the grief. And for me, when Melissa died, I was in such shock. It took me months till I actually found my grief. And then eventually it was like such a relief when the grief burst out of me because I thought there was something wrong with me, that I couldn't grieve. But actually the body stops us from feeling. And I went into therapy at a friend's suggestion for a while. It did nothing because I wasn't ready yet. I was having
Yes.
intellectual conversations. I needed to feel the visceral feelings of terror, of loss, of the world falling to pieces. I needed to go to those places. And I
Mm.
found ways of doing that.
And we are not taught in this Western world to go there, are we? It's the opposite. No,
Exactly.
don't go there. Just get get online and distract or do something or work overwork, but no,
Yeah.
don't go into your feelings. That's the
Well,
hardest thing.
my mother was a master of distraction. You know, whenever we'd fall over as children, and she'd go, "Oh, look at this over here," or "Do you want something to eat?" or something like that. And it was like pain never had a landing place in my
Wow.
upbringing. And so, and I remember one of my girlfriends saying to me, "You can't stand pain. You run away from pain." And I
Mm.
realised that this was true. That actually, I would do anything to avoid pain because that was a learned reaction. And actually
Mm.
now, if I'm talking about Melissa, I never know when I'm talking about her whether there are going to be tears pouring down my face or not. But I don't care if they are. In fact, I welcome them when they are. And when I give talks, sometimes there'll be tears pouring down my face as I talk about her. And I usually almost always bring her into talks that I give because she's now more a part of my life than she ever was when she was alive.
Hmm. Yeah, but you have processed it well.
I am processing it. It's nearly 6 years on now, and I am processing it. But it will never go
Hmm.
away, and I don't want it to go away. But I also want it to keep educating me, and I also want to keep Melissa in remembered in my heart.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. When you talked about I was in shock and I wasn't ready to feel this and to get in touch with my emotions. I was giving a class the other day about grief, and one of the things that I find very repetitive, it's very common with suicide loss, is that sadness. It takes a long time to sink in because there's so many other emotions. There's shock and also sometimes anger. You get stuck in anger for so long that for the sad for you to give, even to get permission to feel sadness, but there is a long road to get there, isn't there?
Well, I'll tell you something interesting. This is how my sadness actually landed. I wasn't even going to mention this, but because you've said that so beautifully, I want to tell you how that landed for me. So 5 months after Melissa's death, and I'd been into therapy, I'd been to the suicide support group, and I hadn't been able to access my tears. There was a playback theatre performance. Playback theatre is a type of where the actors play back the audience's stories. And Melissa was part of a playback theatre group. And so there was a playback theatre performance, and Melissa's mother turned up there as well. And there was a lot of enmity between us. I was feeling very angry and very hurt, and and we ended up having a big row. And
Mm.
at one point, I suddenly realised that by hating her, I was blocking my sadness. And I found myself at that moment in her arms, sobbing, and actually
Wow,
released
what a
that
moment.
released that released the grief. And I was so grateful that that moment had happened. And that didn't mean that I wanted to be around her anymore or to have more relationship with her, but actually in that moment, the magic happened and the grief was released.
Mm. We never know when it's going to happen, do we?
We don't. Now, the other interesting thing is that the subconscious works in different ways as well. So I was desperate to have a dream about Melissa, and I couldn't get a dream about her. And it's like I really wanted to get a sense of what had happened to her, where she was, all of this stuff. And then one day, I think it was probably about 6 months after her death, I had a dream where I'd found out where she was, and I telephoned this place, and someone answered the phone. I said, "Is Melissa there?" She said, "Just a moment." And then this very flat voice answered the phone. She said, "Hello, Mum." And I said, "It's not Mum, it's Dad." And she put the phone down. And that was the only dream I had for
Wow.
2 years. And then 2 years later, I was in Thailand, and I had a dream again about Melissa. And this time, Melissa was at a party, and her mother was blocking the door of the party. And somehow I just ghosted past her mother and looked over at Melissa. And she sent me a look of such love, of such care. And there was such a deep connection
Mm.
that it broke my heart. And I
Mm.
rang my daughter Alex, and she said she'd had almost exactly the same dream that night. How do you
Wow.
how do you deal with that? But it was like that was the moment of healing, and I haven't had another dream since. So only those two dreams, one after 6 months and one after 2 years. But actually, I felt like I was given a gift, certainly in the second dream.
Wow. It's beautiful, isn't it? Our minds always playing tricks on us, huh? In our
And also,
emotions.
our minds have the capacity to go to the mystic as well. And I'm not a mystic sort of spiritual bypasser, but I do think that there is the mystic in our lives as well. And I do think that there is something that is there for us to draw on.
Hmm. Third one, maybe this will be the last, but no, I still have one more. Allow your suffering to transform you. You say we always have two choices, right? We either get stuck and crucified or we let it transform us.
Yes.
So how was your process in that? I mean, did it transform you slowly? Because you said, oh, I was in shock for so long, I wouldn't get in touch with my emotions. So why do you think that that's important? And
Well, I don't
sorry.
believe in revolution. I think revolution doesn't work. Evolution is what works. And for me, the evolving of this, I wasn't going to be able to escape from the suffering. I'd lost my daughter. I couldn't escape from that. My children had lost their half sister, and I couldn't escape from their pain either. So I had to learn to be with my. I'm having to learn to be with my suffering, and actually, there's a joy in really allowing ourselves to grieve. I remember someone coming to see me once, and he said, "Oh, I'm really depressed." And I said, "You're not depressed. You're grieving. You just lost your wife. This is not depression. This is grief." And he suddenly got it that actually there was something beautiful in the grief, and it was a part of the process. And for me, welcoming grief, which was a very new thing for me, welcoming grief was a transformative agent in this process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Welcoming grief. How hard is that, right?
It's very hard, but sometimes when there is no escape, then it's far better to turn and face the enemy, what you see as
Mm-hmm.
the enemy, than to
Mm-hmm.
run and distract.
Yeah, you said that, and I remember this therapist that I interviewed for my book, and he says the most beautiful thing about grief, and it has to do with what you just mentioned, that you name it grief, right? Because we have, I mean, this our society, we have to diagnose it's if you're sad, it's depression, take a pill, right?
Yes.
And yeah, get the quick fix. But he says, grief is about it's like a window into your values. Tell me someone who doesn't grieve, and I'll show you someone who doesn't care.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, yeah, and we never think about grief this way. It's if you don't love, you won't grieve, right?
You talked before, you mentioned anger before. Anger is one of the best ways we can have of protecting ourselves from grief. If we can feel angry, we can put it out there rather than allow it in.
Hmm. Last one, Malcolm. Befriend death. I was reading that chapter, and all I could think about was Irvin Yalom in his book. Yeah, Facing the Sun? But it's about death, death despair or death fear. I don't know. I can't remember the title, but I love that book. And Yalom always talks about the value of befriending death. Because actually, if we didn't have death, we wouldn't do anything,
Yeah.
right? And it's the perspective and the certainty, because it's the only certainty we have, that we're going to die, that keeps us going, right? And that puts us in touch with our values, with what's important to us. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Well, interesting enough, I mean, I've been interested in death for many, many years, and the Buddhists, of course, talk about die before dying, face death before you die. And I started a death group about 10 years ago, and this is before Melissa's death. And it was for people to explore their attitudes towards death, and we would come up with exercises, and people would share their losses. It was a very profound, powerful group. And that group was also in play when Melissa died. And I know that one of the other people said to me, do you want me to run this session? I said, no, I'm going to run it. And I was able to talk about Melissa, and I was able to talk about her death and how I felt about that. And for me, there's something about saying that death is, as you say, is an inevitable part of life. And we are going to die. And if we ignore that, then we really ignore the joy of living as well. And one of my favorite books is Frank Ostazeski, who wrote a book called The Five Invitations. And in it, he founded the Zen Buddhist hospice in San Francisco. And in it, he wrote that there were 5 practices that he started to teach people from seeing when people are dying, what were the things they regretted. And I think if we don't regret our lives, if we live our lives to the full, we can also take our death to the full. I mean, my belief structure is not that we are instantly reincarnated and that we go to some magical Elysian fields in the sky. But my belief structure is that there is a soul inside us that is indestructible. And I've experienced that a number of times in my life, small glimpses of this indestructible, wise being. And that's been enough for me to know that actually this is what we're doing on this planet Earth for this temporary period of time is just what we're doing here, and that there is much more to this than we're aware of. And for me, meditation is a very important part of actually looking and facing death. One of the meditations I do is there's an app called Insight Timer, and one of the
I use that all the time.
Great app, yes. And one of the meditations is to imagine you're dying and to feel what it's like to be done. And I love that meditation because it's a powerful place of looking this in the eyes. Stephen Levine used to write about death and dying, and he would say, imagine you had a year to live, what would you be doing differently? And I would say that if we have an awareness of death, then we have a need to make our lives count as well. So I'm on a journey with death. I don't know where it will take me. Well, it will take me eventually into the grave, but it will take me into a place of some consciousness as well.
You know, Yalom has an exercise that he does with his clients that I love. He says, I often ask this question: what if you had to relive your life over and over and over again? How would that land? How does that land on you? And it's very powerful, isn't it? It's wow to go. It does make you think about, okay, what do I need to change, right? Or is this really something that I would like to repeat? It's a very powerful exercise, isn't it?
It's very, I mean, even as you say it, I'm already thinking, well, there are certain things I would really not want to live again. Normally places where I'd lacked integrity, and definitely places where I'd lacked love. But actually, if I look at my life, I actually feel like I have the blessing of being alive and of experiencing what I'm experiencing and making some contribution to the world as well. And you know, I'm not out to change the world. I think we're all out to change the world in our own small ways as well. But I am out to be of some value in the world and to find my sense of purpose and to really live my sense of purpose.
Yeah, and you are living it, and your book is part of that. Thank you for writing the book.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for being here with us and sharing what you know. And I'm sure your painful experience, as you said, it never ends, right? It's just transformed.
Yeah.
Thank you, Malcolm, for being with us.
Paula, thank you so much. It's really you know, it's for me, it's very refreshing being able to talk about things without having to hide, but actually to explore the very things that are my own exploration anyway. So I'm really happy to come on your show and to share this with you. And I love your interviewing style. Thank you so much. It's really
and it's great to hear you, especially with that accent, you know, that we love, the British accent.
Oh, well, that's really, truly wonderful, my dear.
Nothing beats that.